These are the worst draft picks from every NBA team, starting with the 76ers, who certainly have had their share of disasters. Now, the 76ers are no strangers to draft busts. Of course, Ben Simmons ended up in disaster, but due to him not starting out like that, it's hard to give him the nod here. Sean Bradley surely was not what the 76ers hoped, but still, I don't think anyone can top that of Markelle Fultz. The first overall pick in 2017 surely remains a sore spot for fans to this day. Fultz was drafted as a can't-miss prospect, one who was supposed to seamlessly complement Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons, forming the future of the franchise. However, his time in Philadelphia quickly soured. He struggled with a mysterious shoulder injury that sidelined him for significant stretches, and even altered his shooting mechanics, completely jacking up his shooting stroke for the remainder of his career. His rookie season ended with just 33 games played and an underwhelming 7.7 points per game. What makes this pick even worse, the 76ers traded away assets to move up in the draft to select Fultz first overall, passing on future All-Star like Jason Tatum. It's one of those decisions that still stings in Philadelphia, especially when you look at how Tatum has become the star of a championship franchise, and Philadelphia still can't seem to locate the missing pieces of the puzzle that Fultz was once thought to be. While Fultz has shown promise in Orlando, his time in Philadelphia is often remembered as one of the most disappointing stints in NBA history. Now, Fultz was certainly a flop, but let's see what the Milwaukee Bucks have screwed up. Now, the Bucks have certainly hit gold with Giannis, which is going to go down as one of the biggest diamonds in the rough in draft history. But their record isn't exactly flawless. Kent Benson was the first overall pick in the 1977 draft and is basically only remembered for getting punched by Kareem. And Eric Mobley was terrible in Milwaukee. But their selection of Joe Alexander with the 8th overall pick in the 2008 NBA draft remains the biggest blunder in the franchise's history. Alexander was chosen primarily for his athleticism and raw potential, but he simply couldn't translate that promise into any NBA success. He played just 2 years in the league, averaging a meager 4.7 points before being booted from the NBA by 2010. Real nice work there, Joe. The Bucks passed up future studs like Brook Lopez, Serge Ibaka, DeAndre Jordan, Goran Dragic, Roy Hibbert, George Hill, and Nicholas Batum. I mean, I could pick apart like 90% of this draft. The pick was abysmal, and the draft actually ended up being very deep. Alexander's inability to make an impact was a missed opportunity during a time when the Bucks were going through one of the longest stretches of misery in NBA history. These guys sucked bad, and they sucked for a long time. The Bucks certainly had to go through some obstacles before selecting Giannis, while in the contrary, the Bulls paid for decades of dominance with decades of disaster. If you're watching this right now, there's a 95% chance that you aren't subscribed to the channel, so make sure to change that. It's free and it really helps me get more of these videos out to you at a higher quality and at a longer duration, so make sure you click that button for me. Now, the Bulls are of course famous for selecting MJ with the 3rd overall pick in 1984, but their draft history isn't without its fair share of mistakes. Now, Eddie Curry was certainly a disastrous selection due to him basically being an Enes Kanter at his best, and Marcus Fizer was a really dumb pick as well. But I don't think anyone topped the flop of Jay Williams. Now, Williams was an absolute star at Duke, and never really found his footing in the NBA. But sadly, this was mostly because he never gave himself a fair shot. Williams played just 75 games for the Bulls in his rookie year, struggling like many young guards do while adjusting to the NBA, putting up an inefficient 9 and 5 a night. This is certainly bust-level career numbers, given that he never played again after this. Williams was a motorcyclist against team wishes who actually contractually obligated him to stay off the road out of risk of losing their investments. And that's exactly what happened. Williams, in pretty immature fashion, would ruin his career, crashing his motorcycle and extending the Bulls' run of misery in the process, pretty much making him a lock for one of the worst picks in NBA history. Now, Williams, although his play wasn't great, flopped due to injury more so than just being bad. But this next guy certainly doesn't have any excuse. Now, we all know who the Cavaliers pick is, and it's really not even close. But just to throw a few names out there, I mean, Dion Waiters was pretty bad in Cleveland and ruined his own career pretty much. And DeJuan Wagner was unfortunately ruined by disease, after maybe being the GOAT of high school basketball. But the Cavaliers' selection of Anthony Bennett with the 1st overall pick in the 2013 draft is often regarded as one of the most infamous draft mistakes in league history. Bennett, who was expected to be a pretty dynamic forward, quickly became known for his struggle with fitness, consistency, and confidence. His rookie season was nothing short of terrible, as he averaged just 4.2 points per game. The Cavaliers hoped he would be a cornerstone of the rebuilding process, but after only one season, Bennett was traded and bounced around the league, eventually fading out of the league entirely. Right from the get-go, the pick was met with skepticism as Bennett was not expected to go first overall. I mean, there wasn't a consensus number one player in the draft, as the top players in Rudy Gobert and Giannis were steals, and the lottery was loaded with busts, but Bennett himself was pretty inexcusably bad. I mean, the Cavs have made a few brutal ones, as every team had, and that even includes the Boston Celtics. The Boston Celtics are a team with a rich history of successful draft picks like Larry Bird, Paul Pierce, and Jason Tatum. But even the NBA's gold standard isn't immune to making a few mistakes. It's not typical for the Celtics to be in the lottery, and when they do, they don't often miss. But one of their most notable draft missteps came in 1989 when they selected Michael Smith with the 13th overall pick. Smith was brought in with the expectation that he would be a sharpshooter, but never lived up to the hype. Over the course of his career, he averaged just 5 points per game and 2.4 rebounds, making his impact on the Celtics very minimal. Smith being just a 13th overall pick is often overlooked, which is pretty fair. But what makes this pick especially tough to swallow for Boston fans is that several future Hall of Famers were still on the board when the Celtics chose Smith. Players like Tim Hardaway and Shawn Kemp, who went on to have long and successful careers, could have been the foundation of a more successful roster for the Celtics in the late 80s and early 90s. Instead, Michael Smith's underwhelming career remains a blemish on an otherwise stellar drafting record. Now, the Celtics don't make too many mistakes, but the Clippers have made a career out of it. The Clippers are no strangers to blunders, often trading away their futures since back when they were in Buffalo. Although their preferred method of destroying their team is usually through shit trades, they've certainly had their share of terrible draft picks as well. One of their most infamous failures came in the 1998 draft when they selected Michael Olowokandi with the first overall pick. The Candyman was seen as a raw prospect with a lot of potential, but he never managed to meet those lofty expectations. When it came to the measurable physicals, this guy was a giant, physically gifted freak that also got the benefit of being looked at as a potential Shaq stopper. Unfortunately, the Candyman was thought of as a lazy player who took way too long to become competent on the floor and was always selected this high due to the time he was playing in. Over the course of his career, he averaged just 8 points per game and never truly made a significant impact on the league. The 1998 draft class is considered one of the stranger in NBA history, with as many stars as busts, making Olowokandi's selection even more glaring. Players like Dirk Nowitzki, Paul Pierce, and Vince Carter, who would go on to have Hall of Fame level careers, while Olowokandi is just that guy who makes you say, oh yeah, that guy sucked. Olowokandi's underwhelming career not only remains a major regret for the franchise, but also helps cement the Clippers' reputation as a team that often struggled to make the right decision. But hey, there are plenty of teams with their own questionable picks. Now let's take a look at the Memphis Grizzlies. The Grizzlies are another one with a pretty clear answer, but also in their pretty short history lies a few other shaky picks. Big Country Bryant Reeves is often looked at as a bust, and although he wasn't the best player ever, he did what they drafted him to be good at, which was scoring before his body betrayed him. Big Country wasn't really a bust, but one that certainly was is the forgettable talents of Stromile Swift. Other than just having an insanely cool name, Swift was also an incredibly athletic big guy, with all the talents in the world. I mean, just watch this dunk, and it might be the most powerful slam I've ever seen.
Yes, you are headed to Little Rock, Arkansas. Swift hammers it! A tomahawk from Stromile Swift! And I do want to point out, Little Rock is just...
Apart from having an absolutely insane dunk reel, Swift was really good for nothing. He wasn't as physically imposing as he should be. I mean, there's no reason he shouldn't have been at least a consistent scorer inside and a great hustle guy, but instead, he was basically just a major bust who never improved a bit and left the NBA as raw as he came in. Surprisingly, Swift wasn't the biggest bust in Grizzlies history, despite being picked second overall in the 2000 draft, because that honor belongs to Hasheem Thabeet. Now, Thabeet was also the Grizzlies' second overall pick, expected to be a fantastic interior presence. One of the reasons that Thabeet is the clear answer here is that the 2000 draft class is probably the worst ever, and the 2009 draft class was one of the best in the 21st century. Passing on superstars like James Harden, Stephen Curry and DeMar DeRozan, the Grizzlies royally shot themselves in the foot here. Not only was this class stronger than Swift's by a landslide, but Hashim was just absolutely terrible, man. He played for 5 years, averaging 2-2, and was too slow and weak to guard anyone when expected to be the second coming of Dikembe Mutombo. Although by all teammates' accounts, Hashim is a very nice kid that worked his ass off, this guy was so far from an NBA player, it's unbelievable. The Grizzlies' decision to draft the Beat instead of one of these stars is a mistake that still stings in Memphis. Now, let's see what the Hawks have been up to. Now, the Hawks are just about the most average team ever, and their draft misses have been pretty much as forgettable as the rest of their franchise's history. Guys like Adam Keefe and John Konkek were certainly bad, but throughout many of Atlanta's bad picks, they really didn't miss out on much. But through their history, I think there's one name that stands out a bit more than the rest. The Atlanta Hawks' decision to select Sheldon Williams with the 5th overall pick in 2006 is a draft blunder that still haunts the franchise. Williams was a solid player in college, known for his physical dominance under Coach K at Duke. I mean, he was a pretty solid all-around big guy. A bit of a system player, which when playing under an all-time coach, likely makes you a bit better than you are. But the real death of his career was due to his size. At just 6'8", he was undersized in the NBA. He got away with it a little bit because he was a man-child at Duke, and players are just a bit smaller at the collegiate level. And with a game based on brute force more so than skill, Sheldon Williams was just mis-scouted and overvalued. Over his career, he averaged just 4.5 points per game and 5.5 rebounds, never becoming a consistent contributor to any team he played for. In hindsight, the Hawks passed on several players who would go on to have more significant careers. Guys like Brandon Roy, Rajon Rondo, Kyle Lowry, Rudy Gay, and even JJ Redick would have been far better fits for the Hawks' needs and have much more successful careers in the league. This misstep left the Hawks scrambling to fill the void left by Williams' underwhelming career, and their inability to capitalize on that high pick haunted them for years and have hindered their success in the 21st century. But even one of the most successful teams in the last 24 years has had a couple of screw-ups. The Miami Heat haven't had too many draft picks as of late, as great draft pick in D. Wade toppled some dominoes that led to decades of success. But their selection of Michael Beasley with the 2nd overall pick in 2008 is the pretty easy answer here. The Heat, coming off a disappointing 15-67 season in 2008, had the 2nd overall pick in the draft and were looking for a franchise player to pair alongside superstar in Dwayne Wade. Beasley was a high school legend that played alongside Kevin Durant his whole life, and actually was considered the better player. He was a very versatile forward known for his 3-level scoring ability, defensive potential, and rebounding. His potential was really fucking high, man. He could do it all. He averaged 26.2 points and 12.4 rebounds as a freshman at Kansas State. Many thought Beasley would be Wade's partner in crime for the foreseeable future, as the Heat needed a good offensive weapon. However, things didn't turn out as expected. His NBA career was marred by off-the-court issues and inconsistency. Despite averaging a respectable 12.3 points and 5 boards per game over 238 games, Beasley never reached the level of stardom that Miami had hoped for when they made him the 2nd overall pick. I mean, Beasley was a bit misunderstood. He got made fun of a lot over the course of his career for his stoner appearance and drug suspensions, but this guy was never really that bad. Averaging upwards of 19 a game on good shooting splits, if the Heat hadn't given up on him, and had he played under competent teams that were more open to players smoking like they are now, I actually think there's a world where Beasley would have found a good amount of success. I mean, he was a tweener and his game didn't match perfectly in the NBA, as he could kind of get bullied or burned, but for being the biggest draft bust the Heat have to offer, this one really isn't too bad. On picking Beasley, the Heat passed up on players like Russell Westbrook, who went 4th overall, and Kevin Love at 5. I mean, a K-Love pairing with Dwayne Wade would have been cool, and Russ and the Flash would likely run teams out at the gym, but at least it worked out in the end down south. Now, the Hornets, or Bobcats, have a few great candidates, which I'm sure all Charlotte fans remember all too well. Frank the Tank Kaminsky could fall in this space, I guess. I mean, he was a great college player for the Badgers during their run, but I don't think many people really expected his game to transfer too well to the NBA, and that it sure as hell didn't. Now, the title for the Hornets' biggest flop in my eyes is between two guys. The number 2 pick in the 2012 draft, Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, and the number 3 pick in the 2006 class in Adam Morrison. Now, these guys are kind of two opposites. Both had their injury problems, but both were in very different scenarios. I mean, these guys were kind of both what we expected in the NBA, but teams were a little impatient for their shortcomings. For nearly a decade, Kid Gilchrist was actually a very elite defender, just with a jump shot that was beyond broken in an era that didn't value shooting as much as it does now. Adam Morrison was a really slow-footed shooter whose ACL exploded and basically never played meaningful minutes after his rookie year, never really getting a chance to get his feet set in the NBA. Although blowing a number 2 pick on basically a Josh Okogie sucks pretty hard, picking Adam Morrison seems to suck even harder. Now let's move on to another team that didn't have the best 2010s either. The Utah Jazz have had their fair share of draft mistakes throughout the 2000s and 2010s. I mean, that whole squad around Gordon Hayward and Rudy Gobert flopped pretty hard. Trey Burke, Alec Burks, and Rodney Hood were all pretty disappointing pieces that all seemed to have potential to be at least above average players, but all of which were kind of inefficient shot chuckers trying to make a name for themselves in the NBA, while that whole young core never really went anywhere. I mean, these guys all kind of sucked, but Dante Exum with the 5th overall pick in 2014 was clearly the worst. Exum was touted as a high potential guard with elite athleticism, elite playmaking, and elite defensive capabilities. He was a big guard who could do it all except stroke the 3-ball. Unfortunately, this guy had glass bones and paper skin, as well as being drafted 1 year before Steph Curry's 3-point revolution. Exum might literally be the least lucky player on this entire list, although even when healthy, Exum was one of the worst players in the entire NBA, putting up just 6-2 during his days in Utah on embarrassing efficiency, before being forced overseas very early in his career. To make matters worse, Julius Randle and Zach LaVine were still on the board, both of whom probably wouldn't have moved the needle too much in Utah since role players were all trying to get paid and casting up shots like crazy. Exum is a reminder that even the best talent evaluators can miss on picks when it comes to the NBA draft. I mean, this is one it's kind of hard to predict, translating as poorly to the NBA as he did, but the Kings certainly have less of an excuse. Now this one is difficult, because the Kings are ironically the kings of the draft bust. These guys absolutely suck at scouting talent and have flopped 1,000,001 times. The fact that Ben McLemore is just an honorable mention here speaks wonders, because this was the guy thought to be the next Ray Allen, who put up just 9 points a game on bad efficiency while being a brutal defender. Now, Jimmer Fredette, drafted 10th overall, who was immediately acquired by the Kings, is certainly one of the biggest busts of all time. I mean, this dude had people saying Jimmer when they shot paper balls into the trash. He was a college legend that sucked big time in the NBA. He couldn't really make plays without the ball, nor could he make plays with the ball other than just casting up shots, and his career ended very early, averaging just 7 a game for the Kings. To make matters worse, the guy drafted immediately after him in Klay Thompson went on to become arguably the second best shooter in history, while Jimmer made his money in China. Although Jimmer is the most famous bust by far in Sacramento, in reality he's just their 3rd biggest bust in the last 15 years. Now, Nick Stauskas, drafted 8th overall in 2014, is definitely a disaster pick. Nick Stauskas was supposed to be a lights-out shooter who could score on 3 levels and instantly ignite the offense. Unfortunately, this guy couldn't make a pass without shitting his pants and turning it over. He kinda just got babied by other guards and couldn't play any defense and was a bad off-ball player. I mean, for the exact same reasons, the Kings basically just drafted the European Jimmer Fredette, who actually was a little bit worse, scoring just 4 points a game in Sacramento. At least for Stauskas, the Kings only really missed out on Zach LaVine, so they didn't really lose out nearly as much as Klay Thompson, but while combining missing out on major talent, while also being so incredibly pitiful, you get the 2012 Sacramento Kings selection of Thomas Robinson 5th overall. Thomas Robinson was just another undersized bully ball guy in college that flopped in the NBA, kind of similar to Sheldon Williams. Robinson would be drafted as another post player when DeMarcus Cousins was the only good player on the Kings roster long term, while Damian Lillard was still on the board and was selected immediately after. This was looked at as a bad pick basically immediately by Kings fans, who passed on Damian Lillard for another big guy who would put up 4 points per game, then be traded halfway through his rookie season, due to them already building some youth depth at the guard slot with Jimmer Fredette, who was a Shanghai Shark a few years later, and Isaiah Thomas, who they traded away for a bag of chips. The Thomas Robinson drafting was really just the cherry on top for some legendary levels of dysfunction on a team. The New York Knicks have a long history of draft missteps, but Frederick Weiss, selected 15th overall in 1999, remains one of the most infamous. Weiss, a French center, was a highly regarded prospect heading into the '99 draft, with scouts praising his size at 7'2" and potential as a shot blocker and rebounder. The Knicks drafted him with the hopes of adding size and presence to the Knicks roster. However, he never made an impact in the NBA. This is because Weiss never played a single game in the league. Despite being drafted by the Knicks, he chose to remain in Europe, playing in France rather than coming to the NBA, making his draft a missed opportunity for the team. I mean, the Knicks had a few busts recently in Jordan Hill and Kevin Knox, but if my team just wasted a pick on a guy who declared for the draft and then changed his mind, I would personally be ready to box this guy. This bad luck is pretty fitting for the Knicks, but on the flip side, the Lakers have had some pretty damn good luck thus far. Now, the Lakers play the game on easy mode a bit, acquiring key talents through lopsided trades and star free agent acquisitions since basically the beginning of their run in LA. But that doesn't take away from the fact that they are a historically good drafting team with very few mess-ups. I mean, a lot of the Lakers' young core may have had pretty shaky starts to their career with guys like Lonzo, D'Lo, Clarkson, Ingram, and Julius Randle, but in the grand scheme of things, they were just pawns to a greater plan, all of which ended up being pretty good all-star level talents anyways. Now, the Lakers in the 21st century have one glaring draft miss that more than likely could have swung a playoff series or two throughout the Kobe and Pau days. And that is the 19th overall pick in the 2007 draft, Javaris Crittenton. Now, Crittenton is most infamous for pulling guns in the locker room and committing a homicide, but as far as his on-court success, this guy also struggled immediately. Wasting a first-rounder on a three-point scorer that would be traded before killing somebody is definitely a rough spot on an otherwise pretty squeaky clean draft record. For the Orlando Magic, Spaniard Fran Vasquez represents one of their most frustrating draft choices. In 2005, the Magic selected Vasquez, a skilled center, with the 11th overall pick. He was a capable defender and ended up retiring as the Spanish League all-time leader in blocks. Unfortunately for the Magic, he just never brought that talent to the NBA. After being drafted, Vasquez shocked the Magic and a large part of the NBA community when he decided to stay in Spain rather than come to the US. In Europe, Vasquez went on to have a successful career, becoming the all-time leader in blocks in the Spanish League and winning several championships, including earning the Spanish Cup MVP. Despite his achievements in Spain, none of this helped the Magic, who had hoped to add a talented big man to pair with Dwight as a front-court partner. But Orlando's first-round pick turned out to be a completely wasted opportunity, one that could have been used on a player who's actually committed to playing NBA basketball. Selecting Danny Granger with the 11th overall pick would have been the best move on the board by the looks of it, as Vasquez was literally the worst. Especially since Granger could have fit in great amongst an overachieving team with a focus on perimeter shooting, while Granger could provide some additional shot creating that would have been massive during their big runs with Dwight Howard. Next, we'll move on to another team whose draft history is filled with head-scratching choices. The Dallas Mavericks have cleaned their act up as of late, but through my research, before my time, these guys were the Sacramento Kings of their days. Selecting Randy White 8th overall before Sean Kemp and Tim Hardaway was disastrous, of course, as he'd score 7 a game in 5 years with Dallas before never playing again. Doug Smith was drafted 6th overall in 1991, before starting out pretty strong, scoring 10 a game in his second year, but by his 5th year, he was putting up a whopping 1.9 a game. But I think to really find the Mavericks' biggest draft bust of all time, you need to go all the way back to just their 3rd season in the league. With the talents of Rolando Blackman and Mark Aguirre, the Mavericks so desperately needed a point guard on the roster, given that they had a major lack of talent at the position. But instead, the Mavericks chose to opt with a 6'9" big man out of Wyoming, Bill Garnett. Now, what makes this pick bad is that Bill played 4 years in the NBA, stunk it up, and averaged an inefficient 5 points before never playing again. Now, what makes this pick terrible is that even at the time, Bill's talents were met with extreme skepticism, given that he was playing in the most isolated state in the country, and Fat Lever was a pretty clear pick still on the board. Now, the first time the Brooklyn Nets missed a significant draft opportunity came in their 4th year as an organization. In the 1981 NBA draft, the Nets selected Mike O'Koren, a 6'7" small forward out of North Carolina, as the 6th overall pick in the draft. O'Koren showed early promise and performed well during his first 2 seasons with the team, averaging over 11 a game in both 1981 and 1982. However, Instead of taking the expected third-year leap, O'Cornet's career had a major setback as he struggled with injuries preventing him from reaching his full potential. He would go on to play 9 seasons with the Nets from 1981 to 1988 and spent a single season with the Bullets in 87. Over the course of his career, he finished with averages of 8 points and 3 rebounds per game. While he had a solid start, his inability to maintain consistency due to injuries prevented him from ever being the player that the Nets hoped when they drafted him. Looming just 5 picks later was Kiki Vandeweghe. Vandeweghe would go on to become a key member of the Nuggets, averaging 20 points per game for 7 straight seasons, establishing himself as one of the league's top forwards and top scorers. O'Corn honestly wasn't the worst pick in the world. Granted, injuries were really what derailed his ride to the top, but this next guy's struggles were actually insane. The Denver Nuggets have had their share of misses over the years, but one pick that stands out as the worst. Now, Raef LaFrentz had some insane hype and really just ended up being okay. Emmanuel Mudiay was looked at as a top player in the class since he was in high school, and really just had a terrible run in the NBA, especially during his years in Denver. But these guys have nothing, in my opinion, on Nicolas Skitishvili, selected 5th overall in the 2002 NBA draft. Skitishvili, a 7-footer from Europe, was touted as a player with immense potential. At just 19 years old, he was described as a versatile forward who could shoot from the outside and handle the ball. However, despite a 4-year career in the NBA, Nicolas would never manage to average 5 points per game. Once in the NBA, Skitishvili struggled mightily. Across 4 seasons in the league, he averaged just 2.9 points and 1.8 rebounds, while shooting an abysmal 30.4% from the field. His inability to adapt to the physicality and speed of the NBA game, combined with questionable confidence and skill development, made him one of the biggest draft busts in history. The 2002 draft class wasn't particularly strong, but there were still several impactful players available when the Nuggets took him at 5th overall. Players like Amari Stoudemire and Tayshaun Prince were still on the board, but I mean, it doesn't even really matter who was picked after him, to be honest. For a top 5 pick to come in and score under 3 points per game on 30% shooting and 23% from deep, while being marketed as this ultra-skilled big man, I mean, no offense to Nicolas, but this guy has to go down as literally one of the worst players to ever play in the NBA. The Indiana Pacers have had their share of difficult draft decisions, but one of their most notable mistakes came in 2003 when they traded for Jonathan Bender, who was selected with the 5th overall pick. As a 6'9" big guy with a 7'4" wingspan, he had the physical tools of a future star, including a good jump shot, verticality, ball handling, and shot creation. This guy is largely known as the Kevin Durant before Kevin Durant. Sadly, if you look at Bender's numbers when he was on the floor, the story that it tells you is that he was never even close to the talent that he was supposed to be, averaging just 5 points per game over 8 seasons. While this is true, Bender's really just a what-if in the NBA. Immediately, his lower body exploded, and for the short stints that he was on the floor, he played severely limited. Really, we never got to see Bender in action at full health, which is really just disappointing. What's pretty cool about Bender, however, is that after all of the years of battling injuries, he would actually make some pretty neat inventions in the field of injury recovery devices. Although some good was able to come out of Bender's time in the NBA, it's safe to say that from the Pacers' point of view, this is one of their worst picks yet. For the New Orleans Pelicans, this one's a little tough, as the worst pick they've made is pretty clearly Cole Aldridge in the 2010 draft, who went on to average just 3 points per game, but due to the fact that he was immediately traded to the Thunder, I guess this spot has to fall to Austin Rivers. Rivers was able to etch out an 11-year NBA career in the NBA after being a highly scouted player at Duke, and also one of the most famous high school players ever. But really from the get-go, Austin was clearly not that guy. I mean, he saw a major drop-off in efficiency at Duke from what we'd expect, and just further fell upon entering the NBA. Being a score-first guard who can't score efficiently, defend too well, or take good care of the ball, I mean, there were just a lot of better guards than Austin Rivers. To be fair, the rest of the first round is pretty brutal, and the only real studs were considered steals, including Evan Fournier, Chris Middleton, and Draymond Green. But with pretty limited picks available, I guess Austin deserves this nod, so congrats Austin, I guess. The Detroit Pistons are a team with a pretty rich history, but they also have had some pretty terrible draft picks, honestly. Rodney White was selected 9th overall in 2001 and averaged 3 points per game in Detroit. Stanley Johnson and Henry Ellenson were both pretty trash, and Killian Hayes is already out of the NBA. But Darko Milicic, selected second overall in the 2003 NBA draft, remains the biggest screw-up by far. With LeBron, D-Wade, Bosh, and Carmelo all in the top 5, and the Pistons with an abnormal position at the second overall pick that would go on to win the championship the next year after selecting the clear sore thumb of the group, as all the guys previously stated, of course, would go on to put together very memorable Hall of Fame careers, while Darko really was just serviceable, averaging 6 and 4 for his career, and under 2 per game while in Detroit. Granted, he got no playing time. I mean, I don't personally think Darko was the worst player in the world, as at random times he would explode for like 20 points and 20 rebounds, but as a guy who is noted to hate living in America, and hate playing basketball in America especially, this pick was a disaster. Granted, the Pistons were able to win a chip the next year regardless. The breakup of this squad has not been pretty, as they've been scavenging to scrape together another quality group ever since. Would Carmelo Anthony, who seemed to be their next pick, had they not chosen Darko, have won them another ring? Well, I don't know about that, but as a team that was defined by defense, hard-nosed basketball, and great team play, they probably could have used his talent as a scorer, and Melo could have used these vets to help mold him as a player, since his growth as a player went in all the wrong directions. In more than one way, I think the world really missed out on some good basketball by Darko's selection. Now, the Toronto Raptors have had their fair share of draft mishaps, but Andrea Bargnani, selected first overall in the 2006 draft, remains one of their most infamous. Bargnani, a European big man, was known for his shooting ability and offensive game. Now, he certainly had talent and averaged upwards of 21 points in a season, so far and away from the worst pick in the world. But why is Bargnani still looked at as a massive bust? Well, in his best season, where he averaged 21, he did it on bad efficiency, on a terrible 22 and 60 Raptors squad, while being a 7-footer who couldn't rebound the ball, was a black hole on offense, and couldn't defend a parked car. I mean, Bargnani was more talented than other busts, but honestly, when it comes to actual impact, this guy was still a bust of a number 1 pick. His impact on the game was pretty negative. He chucked a lot of shots while not doing it efficiently, and was a liability in every other aspect of the game. This is kinda just like Timberwolves' Andrew Wiggins. Of course, being selected first overall meant that they missed quite a few stars like LaMarcus Aldridge, who's basically what the Raptors wanted Bargnani to be, as well as Kyle Lowry, who also had a better career. The Raptors certainly picked some worse players over the year, but when it came to keeping them mediocre for way too long, Bargnani did that job all too well. For the Houston Rockets, the selection of Eddie Griffin was a huge mistake. Despite numerous reports of a bad attitude after fighting teammates, Eddie Griffin was hailed as the most talented player in the 2001 draft. Picked 7th overall by the New Jersey Nets, the Rockets traded the 13th, 18th, and 23rd overall picks in the 2001 draft to acquire him. Griffin, a 6'10" big man, was a dominant force at Seton Hall, where he averaged 4.4 blocks per game while being able to stretch the floor. However, his NBA career never reached the height that many expected. During his time in Houston, Griffin averaged 8.7 points, 5.8 rebounds, and 1.6 blocks in 25.2 minutes per game. Despite his defensive abilities being pretty okay, his shooting struggles were terrible, as he posted just 38% from the field and 67% from the line. He straight up couldn't survive in the NBA. Griffin's time with the Rockets came to an end in 2004, when he was waived after missing the entire season due to substance abuse issues. Griffin had one of the most horrific stories I've ever heard, with severe and heartbreaking battles with alcoholism that not only ruined his career, but took his life. Tragically, Griffin's life was cut short when in 2007, he was killed in a car accident at the age of 25. He was struck by a train after disregarding a railroad warning sign, and the wreckage was so bad that only dental records could identify him. The San Antonio Spurs are renowned for their exceptional ability to find talent in the NBA draft. Honestly, they probably take the cake for the best team in the NBA when it comes to finding talents in weird places, which goes hand in hand with their insane developmental program. I mean, they're the San Antonio Spurs. They don't make too many mistakes. But I guess Josh Primo just did it to himself. Primo went much higher than expected to the Spurs, climbing from mid-20s in the mock drafts to 12th overall. I mean, this is a surprise nonetheless, but as a big athletic guard, He had a really high ceiling, although he was really raw. The Spurs were ready to play the long game, extending his contract after his rookie season that saw poor efficiency on 5 points per game. But after this year, of course, he would alter his life forever. Primo would go on to pull his meat out in front of the team psychiatrist numerous times, sparking a legal battle and ruining his career forever. The Spurs' selection of Primo was really a blessing, as shit always seems to work out for them, now landing the prospect of prospects in Victor Wembanyama. But this was certainly one strange period in their history. The Phoenix Suns have had a shit ton of bad picks, from Alex Len, who was a disaster of a 5th pick, William Bedford, who ruined his career doing drugs during the NBA's cocaine craze, and Josh Jackson, who got his infant daughter high and was also one of the worst busts in the last 15 years. But on that list, I would put Dragon Bender, selected the year prior to Jackson, even higher. Now, Bender came into the NBA as a stretch big in Europe at literally the best time possible. Kristaps Porzingis was kind of looked at as his comparable, and Karl Anthony Towns was literally looked at as one of the most valuable pieces in the NBA. The league was transitioning, and the slow-footed bigs of yesteryear like Roy Hibbert were getting replaced, and the Suns were hoping that Bender could be their guy. I mean, in Europe it looked like he could handle the ball and shoot it pretty well, but in reality his stats overseas were terrible, and the Suns threw a Hail Mary way too early. Bender was terrible in the NBA. I mean, to top the list of the Suns' worst picks, you gotta just flat out stink it up. And that he did. They never should have taken a chance on this guy. He was never even close to an NBA player. I mean, he couldn't physically hang with bigs at all. He got pummeled, and shooting 27% from deep as a rookie, I mean, this was really just a disaster of a scouting effort. At the time where the NBA was looking for unicorns, they picked a few donkeys, and Dragon Bender was probably the very worst of them. Now, I said we weren't going to put Cole Aldridge on the Hornets, but this pick has to go somewhere, because holy hell did he flop. And as the Thunder acquired the Hornets' 11th overall pick, Cole belongs in this position for OKC. Now, Cole didn't really have the highest expectations in the world. I mean, his ceiling wasn't very high, and was kind of just expected to go out there and be a pretty good defensive presence, who was okay at everything else, and maybe if all goes well, he could have a long career. But instead, he scored just 3 points per game while being an absolute terrible offensive presence. Now, admittedly, he was okay rebounding and defending, but this guy managed to throw up so many god-awful hook shots at the basket that would come nowhere close to hitting the rim that it was actually kind of impressive. Now, the Timberwolves are also up there with the Kings when it comes to the worst drafting teams in history. I mean, we got some very strong competition here, with Jarrett Culver, Chris Dunn, Wesley Johnson, and Derek Williams, just to name a couple. But selecting Johnny Flynn with the number 6 pick in the 2009 draft, especially considering the talent that they passed on, has to be the answer here. In 2009, the Timberwolves had back-to-back picks at number 5 and number 6. With the 5th pick, they selected Ricky Rubio, a talented point guard from Spain who ended up pretty okay. Then, drafting another point guard back-to-back to take a disaster of a pick in Johnny Flynn, just for Steph Curry to go 7th to the Warriors the very next pick. Unlike many other draft busts, Johnny showed some promise during his rookie year. He immediately put up decent numbers, averaging 13.5, playing on a roster with little talent beyond Al Jefferson. Sadly, Flynn's fall from glory would be quick and drastic. After his rookie season, he had hip surgery, and only started 8 games the following season, averaging 5 points. The Timberwolves' decision to draft both Flynn and Rubio was part of David Kahn's vision to create a dynamic, high-energy backcourt with an NBA at the time trending towards smaller, faster lineups. As Flynn's career would ultimately flop due to poor decisions and injuries, this just added so much insult to injury. I mean, drafting back-to-back point guards is pretty stupid regardless. When you do that and still miss out on Steph Curry, you should probably fire the whole roster and start on over. Portland Trail Blazers' most infamous draft mistake is surprisingly even bigger than the selection of Sam Bowie with the 2nd overall pick in the 1984 NBA draft ahead of Michael Jordan. Bowie, a 7-foot center out of Kentucky, was highly regarded for his skills, athleticism, and potential to be a dominant force in the NBA. However, his career was plagued by injuries, which prevented him from ever living up to the immense expectations placed on him. Bowie did have some solid years in the league, but his injuries consistently held him back from achieving greatness. He averaged just 10 and 7.5 per game over his career, a far cry from the levels of dominance that was expected from a top 2 pick. Meanwhile, Michael Jordan, selected 3rd overall, went on to become the greatest player of all time, leading his team to 6 championships and winning 5 MVP awards. Jordan's impact on the game, both in terms of individual accolades and championships, has made him a global icon and a central figure in NBA history. The Blazers' decision to pass on Jordan in favor of a player with a significant injury history has haunted the franchise for decades. However, despite Bowie being more infamous, LaRue Martin takes the title of the Blazers' worst draft pick. Why? Because Bowie at least contributed when healthy. Martin, on the other hand, never made an impact. The Blazers drafted LaRue Martin with the first overall pick. At 6'11", Martin was supposed to be the next big thing in the league. However, he struggled from the start, averaging just 5 points and 4 rebounds over his brief 4-year career. To make things worse, the Blazers picked him over Bob McAdoo, who went on to become a league MVP and a Hall of Famer. For a dishonorable mention here, I guess you can throw in Greg Oden, since after all they did miss out on Kevin Durant, but to give him a bit of leeway here, I think it's fair to give it to a guy who has less of an excuse. While the Warriors have experienced significant success with their draft picks in recent years, one of the most glaring failures remains the selection of Chris Washburn with the 3rd overall pick in the 1986 draft. Washburn, a highly touted big man from North Carolina State, was expected to bolster the Warriors' front court and become a key player for the team. Unfortunately, his career was derailed by off-the-court issues, a poor work ethic, and a drug dependency. Washburn only played for a few years in the NBA, averaging just 3 points and 2.4 rebounds per game before fading from the league. His lack of impact, combined with the Warriors' inability to get anything meaningful from the pick, makes this selection one of the franchise's biggest mistakes to this date. The Warriors could have selected future stars like Mark Price, who was selected 25th, or Dennis Rodman, who would go on to become one of the greatest rebounders in NBA history. The Warriors' decision to select Washburn over these future stars is a painful reminder of the volatility of the draft process. Now, last but not least, the Warriors' selection of Jan Vesely with the 6th overall pick in the 2011 NBA draft remains one of the team's most regrettable decisions. Jan was a forward from the Czech Republic who was highly touted for his athletic ability and potential to thrive as a versatile player. Unfortunately, his lack of an offensive game, poor shooting, and inability to adapt to the NBA's speed and physicality led to a disastrous career. At the time, the Warriors were looking for a dynamic player to complement their young roster, but Vesely's struggles on both ends of the ball left them without a reliable contributor. Playing only 3 seasons in the league, averaging 3.6 points and 3.5 rebounds before heading back to Europe. Adding to the sting, the Wizards passed on future stars like Kawhi Leonard, Klay Thompson, and Jimmy Butler, all of whom became franchise-changing players. After 2 uneventful seasons with Washington, Jan's career came to an end, and he was traded to the Denver Nuggets in 2013. He then played overseas in Europe, where he had a somewhat more successful career, but never reached the level of an early first-round draft pick. Make sure you guys watch this video on the NBA players who have been blackballed here, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and peace out.